Chapter 9, Emotions. Emotions play a significant role in our communication competence. Understanding our emotions, how we respond, how we're feeling before we respond, or what happens after we deliver a response that we're not satisfied with. We need to understand what our emotions, the influence that they have on our expressions, being able to effectively express those emotions when we're communicating, and managing the emotions when we're in different environments. Our goal as competent communicators is to master and understand the validity of our emotions. Social scientists generally agree that there are several components to emotions. It's a phenomenon that has been researched, and it's very interesting in communication how our emotions have several influences, have several components to them. Emotions can be both positive and negative. Daniel Goleman developed the term emotional intelligence. And this term helps us describe the ability to understand and manage our own emotions and how to be sensitive to the emotions of others. Emotional intelligence is a recent term, I'd say in the last maybe decade and a half, that we've heard more and more. It is important to develop our knowledge and understand our own emotions and how we can manage them. It's also part of our face work, and I think connects back to our identity, and all these pieces influence how we communicate with others in different environments. As previously introduced, there are several components to emotions. We have the physiological changes, the nonverbal changes, and the cognitive interpretations. So the physiological, those are the bodily changes, our heart rate, our blood pressure, we feel hot, we feel shaky, we feel cold. It could be so many different responses that each of us have with our emotions. I think about when you had to deliver your self-introduction in this class, it's online, and when I teach an in-person class, boy, those physiological changes just soar. You feel so many different things you didn't even know existed in your body. Some of the nonverbal behaviors include maybe blushing, perspiring, or your posture. Some things that also happen in the online delivery is people sway in their chair. If you have a chair that turns or spins, or you'll play with like a pen or something, or your hair. So these are gestures that occur non-verbally. Also our vocals, our tones. Sometimes we have a very high pitch, or if we get dry mouth, we can hardly get a word out. So those are all tied to emotions and how it impacts us. And then our cognitive interpretation is highly affected by emotions, as our mind plays an important role in determining how we feel when we're trying to understand an emotion or a feeling. How do we interpret that? When we look at an event and we're experiencing something, what is the emotional impact that it has? So reappraisal is a term that helps us rethink the meaning of the events and to alter the emotional impact. You know, there's also verbal expressions that can be necessary to communicate our feelings and validate or affect the labels that we're placing on how we're feeling. Emotions are such a great topic to study and understand because it impacts us in a multitude of ways. And verbal expression, when we think about communication, verbal, nonverbal, but the verbal may be necessary so that we can clearly communicate what we're feeling, right? The expression is clearly expressed. However, many times we don't have labels for these feelings, and it's very important, especially with children, as you're around a child. They may not know what anger is, or joy, or fear. They're feeling something, but they don't have it attached appropriately to a label. So it's really important to learn the labels to these feelings and begin to communicate them clearly. So in the image on this slide, we can see how our body changes, that physical change that takes place, the different degrees of intensity that are impacted. So the reflection of the heat on our bodies, we can see those changes. And we use specific emotions to represent the different degrees of intensity. So we may be sad, but that sadness can turn into maybe anger, or it can turn into fear. So understanding what they are is important. Often we go throughout our days without even thinking about our emotions. Try to keep what your textbook refers to as a body budget and see what your emotions are throughout the day. Research has found that we all have the ability to reveal our emotions, but over time, we develop differences in how we express emotions. It's always interesting and amazing to me how life, culture, environment impact who we become and how we communicate. As previously highlighted, influences on our emotional expressions based on culture, environment, experiences. So we're all born with the ability to reveal emotions, but over time they change. In this short clip, The Atlantic, How to Turn Anxiety into Excitement, I hope you're interested in going back to the PowerPoint to watch it. It looks at how our cognitive reappraisal, how we can change our emotional responses in stressful situations. I would challenge you to try this approach the next time you're feeling anxious. Around the world, people have the same experiences with emotions. They may interpret them in different languages, but they're the same events, and within different cultures, they can have different significance. So when you think about individualism and collectivist, those cultural norms will influence the emotional expression within their culture. So we are quite open here in an individualistic society, low context. We're very open about how we're feeling, whereas in a collectivist, they're going to hide those emotions, especially if it's something they don't agree with. They're going to save face and keep it to themselves. And gender roles often shape the way in which male-female experience and express their emotions. But again, those are also influenced by our environments. So there are stereotypes. Research has found that despite the stereotypes about the different effects of hormones on sexes, males are just as emotional as females. So don't allow those stereotypes to impact your opinions. Also, socialization and our gender roles will shape the way that male and females express their emotions. There is some truth to cultural stereotypes that males are in are not as expressive or inexpressive, whereas females are more expressive, or in your text referred to as demonstrative, more open. But men and women experience, male, female, experience the same emotions, but there's going to be differences in the way they express them. Again, influenced by our environment, our culture, our upbringing, our experiences. In the previous slide, I started to think about some family dynamics. My family is Nicaraguense. My children's father is Puerto Rican. So we have a lot of expression in both cultures, but I also think that as Latinos, we also are very expressive. In the North American aspect of the families, there's a great difference in my family that is immigrated from Nicaragua are much more of a high context expression. They don't express as openly as my Puerto Rican side of the family. So it's just very interesting. Social conventions and roles will affect how we express our emotions. So I mentioned briefly about culture, gender roles, and social conventions. But when we think about emotional labor, it's how we are managing, how we're suppressing or expressing our emotions, and are they appropriate? Are they necessary? It's a very challenging phenomena, and sometimes I'll experience this with my students, where you're very expressive, very emotional, you're under a lot of stress, trying to meet deadlines, trying to understand not only instructions in this class, but in 4 other classes. And each of your instructors are different depending on the content, the approaches, everything's so different, and it can be very stressful. So people around the world, just remember that they experience the same emotions, but they're different in each culture. In the classroom, each of our topics, each of our specialty areas that we've learned under, we're going to express differently. We're a math instructor, a science instructor, and then you have communication. So very different. We might be much more individualistic, where in the science department they might be a little more collectivist. It's very interesting as we start to consider and break down our emotional expressions. I have addressed culture and have highlighted the differences in a high context, low context, or individualistic, collectivist differences, where your high context collectivists will probably hide their emotions more than we do as North Americans, or individualistic, low context. Research has found through mediated communication that these points that we spoke about earlier don't generally follow, because people are more expressive online than they are in person. So social media can absolutely feed more emotional responses. And senders and receivers are going to be more responsive, but they may be a little more intense, but also might be cautious, kind of examining responses a little more carefully, or before you send a message, you get a chance to kind of review it 2 or 3 times before you actually send it. Where when it's face to face, you don't have that flexibility. And just to finalize the previous slide, having that flexibility really depends on what your preference is. I don't know. I know for me personally, I rather not put things in writing. I rather just say it once and be done with it. It's not repeatable. I feel safe in that environment. All right, so moving on to some of the influences on emotional expression, social conventions. We talked a little bit about emotional labor and how much work's involved in us trying to manage that emotional work, if you will. But there's also emotional contagion, and it's where our emotions can be transferred from one person to another. So a perfect example is laughing or crying. Laughing is one of those common contagious emotions. A lot, a lot about emotions, right? There's so much involved, but we can express our emotions effectively. Definitely we can do that. And how do we start? By recognizing our feelings. You have to go back and think about the labels. What are you feeling? Add a name to it. If you don't have a diverse list of terms for your emotions, take time to go back and look at a list of labels for emotions. Understand what they are so that you can effectively express how you're feeling. Choose the best language. Being able to identify what it is that you're feeling, but be able to understand emotional vocabulary. Don't be impoverished. Get out there and learn and understand. While it's common for us to have mixed feelings or multiple feelings, when you have more than one emotion at a time, try to focus on just expressing one at a time. And recognize that there's a difference between feeling and acting, exposing it, acting it out. Just because you feel a certain way doesn't mean you have to act on it right away. So there's a difference in a moment. Like I might see something that makes me sad or reminds me of something that brings up an emotional response, but it's just for that moment. I might be able to process it and apply it to where it's coming from, but it's not something I want to share. So be very cautious about that. Accepting responsibility for your feelings and not blaming others for how you feel. If you had a negative response to something, own it. But it may not be the same expression or emotion that somebody else has. And then just remember that when you're expressing your feelings, make sure you consider the environment. Is it the right time? Is it the right place? It's so important. Sometimes I just want to say things and then I consider the environment and I realize that if I say it, it's just going to make the situation worse, escalate maybe emotions. So take your time. Think about how you're communicating. Get those labels for your emotions. Learn the language of emotional communication. Continuing on this topic of being able to add labels to what you're feeling, explain by using your words what you're feeling, and be able to provide an example. So a granularity in emotion descriptions, be able to just give an example. I feel sad right now. I'm not really sure why I'm feeling sad. It could have been something that you said that reminded me of X, Y, and Z. I'm not blaming you for it, but I need you to help me work it through. So the more you are able to work through them and talk with them without having any heightened emotion reaction, the more success you will have and the greater maturity in becoming a competent communicator. Your emotional intelligence will increase greatly. So consider these things that we've just discussed. I think they're very important in our journey of becoming a competent communicator. It's valuable to understand what we're actually feeling and how we're describing those feelings. Well, we won't have a discussion about this, but I think it's helpful to understand the importance of perception checking and our emotions. So I might feel scared because I perceive an environment or person a certain way. I have to take a step back and really think about a lot of things in a short amount of time. It happens very quickly. But I want you to practice perception checking, not only in person when you're seeing something visually, but how you're hearing something, how you're interpreting something if you're reading a message, a mediated message, or you're having an audible conversation. Perception checking is so important in successful expression of emotions. Textbook introduces facilitative, debilitative emotions. And so being able to have a language for our emotions is very important, because we can hinder a situation if we don't have a clear understanding. So facilitative emotions are going to contribute to an effective outcome, where your debilitative emotions will hinder and prevent an effective result. So debilitative emotions are those that are more intense, and they also last longer. So they're going to hang around a little longer, those feelings, those emotions. So you want to not allow them to ruminate. And your thoughts, your self-talk, we talked about that. What is our emotive approach? How are we handling these things? Very important in our development of becoming a competent communicator, but also increasing our emotional intelligence. So remember that your environment is impacted by your thoughts. And so you need to make sure you carefully review those thoughts, because our thoughts will cause feelings. It's a rational emotive approach, and so our feelings can change for the positive or the negative. So it's important to rethink unproductive interpretations of our feelings, and to understand that we have the ability to reappraise and change that, and be very careful about that self-talk. We want to change that monologue that's going on inside of us. And consider all of this, it happens so quickly. When we're communicating, it's happening very quickly. We can't move on from the emotion chapter without discussing what some of the fallacies are with emotions, irrational thinking, and debilitative emotions. So we mentioned that previously, and we have to be very cautious about it. So many of our debilitative feelings come from the acceptance of an irrational thought. That self-thought can really be destructive. So the fallacy of perfection is a thought that a competent communicator should be able to handle any situation with complete confidence and skill. That's a fallacy. None of us can. The fallacy of approval is a mistaken belief that is vital to obtain everyone's approval. We're out there trying to find that, and we get disappointed if it's not there. That's a fallacy. The fallacy of should is the inability to distinguish between what is and what should be. What is and what should be. So make sure that that self-talk is validating truth and not an assumption. The fallacy of overgeneralization. It occurs when a person has a basis, a belief on a limited amount of evidence. You just got a little piece of the pie. You don't know the whole story. That's the fallacy of overgeneralization. In gossip situations, we're going to find that a lot. The fallacy of causation is the belief that one should not do anything that will harm or inconvenience others because it's going to cause undesirable feelings. Well, causation is not something that you can control. You can't do anything unless you're intentionally harming, but most of the time we're not. The fallacy of helplessness is suggesting that there are things beyond your control that create satisfaction or dissatisfaction in life. And that is a fallacy, because we don't need to be helpless. We have support. We have just so many great and wonderful things around us that we don't need to be lost in helplessness. And then the final fallacy on this list is catastrophic expectations. When you assume that if something bad can happen, then it's going to happen. Thinking about Murphy's Law, right? If it's going to be bad, it's going to be worse than bad. So these fallacies can be detrimental to our communication progress. So make sure that you think about how, if any of these are operating in your life, be honest with yourself. This is an opportunity for you to grow and learn about these points of reference to help you become emotionally intelligent and increase your competency as a communicator. And again, as a repetition, irrational thinking and debilitated feelings or emotions can really change a situation. So make sure you're focusing on developing your emotional intelligence, positive self-talk, and fight against those fallacies. So what can you do to get started on minimizing these debilitative emotions? I mentioned earlier to challenge yourself, but begin to monitor your reactions. Pay attention to what you're doing each day, with whom, and how you're responding to them. And then take some time quietly, privately, and consider why you're having those reactions. Why are you constantly feeling this debilitative response to this person or this situation? You know, what is the activating event? What is the trigger? Jot down what your self-talk is. What are you saying to yourself? Analyze your thoughts and challenge your irrational beliefs. Reappraise them, change them. Change the way that you're looking at things or saying things. Change your self-thought and consider what your options really are. So this is more of a rhetorical approach that I just want you to think about how and why talking about feelings can make things worse. Yes, it is important to express our feelings, but how can it make things worse? And has that happened to you? So when others ask for help, how do you respond? Do you jump in? Do you dive in? Or do you take some caution and say, hey, I'm happy to listen to you, but I really think that you should consider a different source or recommend a different source? How are you handling or regulating emotions in your interpersonal relations? So we heard the term debilitative. So now let's look at facilitative. How can we maximize facilitative emotions? How can we get that emotional agility that allows us to reappraise and to change situations around and take advantage of positive opportunities? Situations that seem negative can help us grow. Focus on what you gained rather than what you lost in that situation. Use compassion over contempt. And view yourself as a competent communicator, and that the goals that you're reaching or promoting are for success. It may not always have a successful outcome, but that's what you're seeking. Set that tone for yourself. So make sure that you are focusing on positivity in your emotions. Even like when I'm angry, I take a minute and I think about the environment and I say, okay, if I say something right now, it's not going to be good because the other person isn't in a good place, or I'm not in a good place. Let me just take a break. And you can't always leave the room, but if you can, it's good to say, hey, I need to go to the restroom, I'll be right back. Try not to make it so obvious to add more heat to it, like I got to get out of here, I can't take this, right? So I typically use a restroom, or I just need to get some air for a minute, I'll be back. Just something that's not so intense that increases the negativity. And I try to look at the positive. I try to look at not what I'm going to lose, but how can I gain in that situation. And it's really hard, but it's doable. It's possible. And so these are 10 emotions that are basic to positivity. You can consider them, apply them, whatever works best for you. But I do believe that this is a great opportunity for you to just reevaluate where you're at emotionally. This is a great short clip that helps us focus on gratitude and how to maximize facilitative emotions and discuss within ourselves how gratitude can help us and how this can increase happiness. So again, going back to the PowerPoint file to access this link. We have completed chapter 9 on emotions, and we reviewed how emotions are experienced and expressed, the various personal and social influences on emotional expression, how to express your emotions appropriately and effectively, and understand the differences between facilitative and debilitative emotions, understanding how reappraisal can be used so that you can manage your emotions effectively, the importance of developing and maturing your emotional intelligence, and increasing your success on your communication competent journey.